The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar series. If anyone has any questions this morning, you can type them into the question section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to Crop Talk for May the 1st. Today we're going to have Tammy Jones on, and Tammy's going to be speaking to us about weed resistance and spring management of some of the spring management things we can do to help with weed resistance. Being that a lot of producers are just nicely getting started out in the field, I think there are some options there that we can be looking at, and some things we definitely should be doing to identify some of these weeds that are starting to show up as being resistant. From there, we'll switch over to a crop update, and I'll give a little bit of an update of what's I've been seeing has been happening in the field over the last week. And with that, Lori, I think we'll turn the screen over to Tammy and let's get started.
Okay, let's go. So I'm going to focus mainly on early season weed control, and then at the end of the present removal. And it's rare that I've had anyone come back to me after doing a pre-seed burn and say, yeah, that was a total waste of time. And if we look at the literature, the Ag Canada weed scientists like Neil Harker and John O'Donovan estimate that the yield effect of one weed emerging a week before the crop is about the same as 100 weeds emerging 3 weeks after the crop. So there are certainly some economic thresholds that come into play. And while it's fairly easy from the road to think that the field is bare and there are no weeds in there and you can just go in and seed, there are very good reasons why you might want to take a closer look. The main one being that you're going to maximize your yield potential. As soon as you have weeds in that field, you're using up soil moisture, you're using up nutrients, and up until this last little bit of snow and moisture that we've had, we were looking at a fairly dry start to the spring, and certainly any weeds that were in there were tying up that valuable moisture. The other benefit to early season weed removal really is that there are smaller weeds which are usually easier to kill. We just have to be sure that they're not too small. A single leaf wild oat is a challenge. A tiny little bit of foxtail barley is a challenge, and you need to make sure that you've got the right water volume or the right droplet size to stick on that weed. So sometimes too small is a challenge, but in most of the cases, the pictures that Lionel sent me that I'm going to show in this presentation, we don't have to worry about those weeds being too small. So one of the other advantages of using a pre-seed burn is that you can use a soil residual herbicide and still have maximum flexibility for recropping in future years. So the benefits of a soil residual herbicide include time management. Let's get that on before we seed the crop. When things get, highly pressured, if we get a rain delay, you're still working, or a snow delay like we just had, you're still working towards getting your seeding done, and that usually transitions quite quickly into your in-crop seed or weed spraying. So it's very challenging to transition through those. If we do something up front and we have some extended control, that really helps with keeping your crop weed free for as long as possible, helps with flushing weed control. And we can also use some alternate modes of action with the pre-seed and pre-plant incorporated herbicides that we can't typically use as in-crop weed control. And that's important as we are looking at resistance management, to have multiple modes of effective action and look at herbicide layering to control those flushing weeds. So some of the common soil residual herbicides are up on the screen now. Some of them are post-emerge, but if we look at the group 3s and group 8s, those are certainly ones that are only used in a pre-plant incorporated. The same with the 5s, so atrazine, that type of thing. Some of the 14s, group 14s, can be used as post. There are some that are used as a pre-seed burn as well. And then group 15s are usually a pre-plant incorporated or a pre-seed or a post-seed pre-emerge. And we'll also get into some of the challenges about why that is a benefit at times, but also can be a bit more challenging to time. Some factors that affect the herbicide persistence, these can be good when we're looking at extended control, or bad when we're looking at recropping restrictions, but those include our soil characteristics like our texture, organic matter, and pH, the herbicide characteristics, its half-life, or whether it breaks down more quickly at a high pH or a low pH, soil interception and plant residue, so organic matter can also be a factor in that you have that standing stubble or straw that's on the field causing some interception and making it less effective to get into the soil. Rainfall, not only for activation in the spring, but also distribution over the year as far as the breakdown. The rate of herbicide applied is important because the higher the rate, the slower it tends to break down. Your application date and growing conditions following planting in the spring. And the one that really comes to mind for me there would be something like fomasafen, where if it's sprayed and then you have a couple of weeks of really dry weather, it tends to adsorb to the soil more and then lingers longer. If we look more closely at the soil's impact on herbicide persistence, the soil temperature that impacts on the microbial activity within the soil, the moisture again impacts on microbial activity, but it also impacts on the actual chemical degradation of the product. Reduced soil moisture causes herbicides to bind more tightly to soil particles, again adsorption, which then makes it unavailable to degrade or for plant uptake, so then renders it ineffective for weed control. The organic matter and soil texture, the clay content, that's looking at how that herbicide binds to the soil. The higher the organic matter, the higher the clay content, the more adsorption, the less there is available for plant uptake, and the longer that herbicide will typically last in the soil. And a pH 7 is neutral, and certainly that pH for some herbicides, acidic conditions will cause it to linger longer, and in other cases, more basic or higher pH will cause that herbicide to linger longer. So at Crop Diagnostic School last year, we looked at a couple of different soil residual herbicides, and on the screen you will see a very busy slide. On the left is no herbicide, in the middle is metallochlor, and then atrazine, which is a group 5 on the right. And you can, at the bottom, there's no rain for activation or for leaching, 1 inch of rain in the middle set of trays and 3 inches in the top set of trays. Obviously, no herbicide is showing you what kind of weeds came up at different times. When you have no rain, then you see that there is delayed emergence of those weeds, and up until recently we hadn't had a lot of soil moisture, so we were looking at delayed emergence of those weeds, but quite rapidly after we get some soil moisture, then weeds tend to take off. And you can also see that with no rain, something like atrazine, it doesn't activate as well. But with lots of rain up in that top right corner, you can see that we're seeing some green foxtail escapes, and that's because the atrazine has moved down in the soil profiles. So water solubility is one of the things that we look at for a herbicide characteristic when we're looking at our soil herbicides and how they act, and also the volatility, so the vapor pressure. And you can see that metallochlor, or we use dual 2 magnum, is something that has a lower vapor pressure, more volatile. And then we also look at the water solubility, as I mentioned, and we can see that both atrazine and metallochlor are water soluble, whereas something like treflan, trifluralin, very non-water soluble. The water in the soil moisture does not have an impact on how it is activated. And that certainly impacts on how we use those different herbicides as soil applied herbicides. So for metolachlor, when we're trying to maximize the effectiveness, we need to keep in mind that it is moderately volatile, so we do need to incorporate it after application. It also requires some rainfall in order to activate. It will wash off of surface residue with rainfall, but it will volatilize if it stays on the residue for too long. So let's get that incorporation to happen. But it will also leach with heavy rainfall, and you can see that in sandier soil, we see more leaching, which is on the right of that tray, and so you see more volunteer canola coming through. And also, we can get it moving into the seed row, which can be dangerous for crop injury. Trifluralin, on the other hand, not water soluble, as I mentioned, but a little bit more volatile, so it must be incorporated like right after our application. But then it binds tightly to the surface residue, so it won't wash off without rainfall, right? As I mentioned, not water soluble. So you need to spray to make sure that you're getting that. If you're using a solution instead of a granule, that you need to spray in the direction of the stubble. If you're using your granule, then obviously that's not important. You just need to have the incorporation. And with trifluralin not being highly water soluble, once it is incorporated and it gases off and makes that gas layer, there's not much chance of it impacting on the seed, because the seed's going to be placed below that herbicide layer and have no impact then as far as the crop goes, just impacting on those shallow germinating weed seedlings. Something like peroxysulfone, which would be in Zidua group 15, non-volatile. So in that particular case, incorporation can be a detriment because it's not forming a gas layer. So if you move the soil around, you can clump up some of that active ingredient in certain areas. It does require water for activation. So a delay in rainfall can result in early season poor weed control if it's been dry. The weeds have enough to germinate, but they don't have enough soil moisture to have that active ingredient in the soil solution to be uptaken into the plant. It will wash off of the surface residue and it will not volatilize, so it isn't lost. That's how, once you spray it on and you get that moisture activation, then you get that blanket coverage with something like peroxysulfone. And sometimes that's why it works better as a post-seed pre-emerge, because then you get that blanket coverage, no stripping where the seed rows are. Now, heavy rainfall can leach it below the weed seed zone and into the crop zone, so there can be some crop injury and less weed control. So it really depends on the volatility, so the vapor pressure, and then on the solubility of the herbicide, how you maximize its efficacy as a pre-plant incorporated or a pre-emerge product. One of the other things that's very important, and that the Australian government has done some really great videos on, is how to maximize soil interception with those pre-plant incorporated, not really as much, but the pre-emerge, solutions that you're spraying onto the surface. Looking at the spray direction and the wind direction, so spray in the same direction as the rows were seeded last year, so that you're having less interception with any standing stubble. Wind direction, if you can get a crosswind, it sort of jiggles those droplets better into the crop residue and down onto the soil. If you reduce your travel speed, you see your droplets fall down more instead of moving forward with the momentum of the sprayer. So a reduced travel speed helps with more soil interception rather than standing stubble interception. Larger droplet sizes are recommended. Water rates being at full label rate, increased water rates helps with better soil interception as well. The other thing about droplet size that's really interesting is that if you use a solid droplet instead of an air induction nozzle that produces an air-filled droplet, those solid droplets, if they hit the straw, they will shatter into medium-sized droplets and continue to fall down onto the soil. whereas if it's that air induction droplet, that's still a larger droplet, but when it hits standing stubble, it shatters. There's more fine droplet sizes in there then with the shattering, and more susceptibility to drifting or volatilization. So using a solid traditional nozzle that produces a solid droplet rather than a fluffier air induction nozzle is really important. The nozzle angle and the nozzle spacing can be tweaked to also increase soil interception. So the nozzle angle, tilting it back 10 to 15 degrees, will help that gravity take over with that droplet and encourage more droplets to actually hit the soil rather than standing stubble again. And the nozzle spacing with boom height can help you as far as coverage and reducing any drifting and that sort of thing. So there are some YouTube videos out there that are well worth looking at, because they do a better job of explaining all of those factors than I just did. That was the quick condensed version of it. Tillage. Now, tillage is part of a pre-plant incorporated system, right? It's the incorporation part, and it is necessary for those volatile chemicals, but it needs to be shallow and consistent. Shallow because you don't want to dilute the amount of herbicide that is in that layer, and consistent because you want a nice even layer of herbicide for interception by those weeds so that you prevent them from emerging. So this is also important because it helps effectively distribute your surface residue. So sometimes a little bit of tillage beforehand can help remove some of that, those beaver lodges or those straw piles that can impact negatively on how well that herbicide gets to the soil. The downside of tillage, it can bury weed seeds, which prolongs seed longevity. So you're just putting more weed seeds into that seed bank. As I mentioned, it does dilute the herbicide layer. So the deeper you till, the more diluted the herbicide layer is. And sometimes as the herbicide breaks down over time, then your extended control period is shortened, or you have a sublethal dose, and that doesn't help with controlling your weeds effectively. Now, tillage can also cause breaks in coverage, similar to seeding with wide sweeps, right, where you move the dirt and then you have those strips in the seed rows where weeds can emerge. And finally, coming from southwestern Manitoba, where I grew up, I'm well aware that tillage has occasionally caused some soil erosion. So there are reasons why the pre-plant incorporated types of herbicides like edges and fortress aren't always used, but they certainly do have a fit when you're trying to incorporate different modes of action and get after some of those resistant weeds. There's always this, maybe instead of doing a pre-seed burn or a pre-plant incorporated, maybe I can just do that post-seed pre-emerge application. It's going to give us more time for those weeds to germinate, and I'm going to get that effective blanket of coverage. There's not going to be any breaks in the herbicide layer. There are some downsides to waiting for post-seed pre-emerge applications. Weeds that are already germinated have at least 5 more days of good growing conditions all alone before that crop starts to be competitive. And like I said earlier, 1 weed a week ahead versus 100 weeds 3 weeks after has the same kind of economic threshold. So there are some low tolerances to having those weeds that emerge early. Those weeds grow very quickly, and sometimes you get out of the proper staging for a particular herbicide. So that does need to be considered when you're waiting to spray. Also, depending on your seeding operation, in a minimum till type of scenario, you can still have some damage to those weeds so that they are kind of just sitting there, not actively growing, trying to recover from, their roots being disturbed a little bit. And so if they're not actively growing, they're not actively taking up herbicide, and they're not going to be controlled by that post-seed pre-emerge herbicide. And the other thing is that they could be covered with soil or they might even just have been dusted on, and that dust adsorbs the herbicide and it doesn't get taken up by the weed. Timing really is everything. So in addition to maybe that weed getting ahead of the crop significantly, ground cracks, or seed rows that aren't filled in very well, or excessive precipitation shortly after that post-seed pre-emerge application but before crop emergence, can allow some of that leaching to happen with the herbicide, getting herbicide into the seed row, which can cause some crop injury as well. So there are some risks to go with the rewards. And this just kind of, flushes it out a little bit more. If a burn-off doesn't get done before the crop emerges, there is the potential for some significant yield loss. That in-crop weed control then needs to happen earlier. And if you have flushing weeds or late emerging weeds like an annual sow thistle or some wild oats, or kochia that's late emerging, that early in-crop weed control isn't going to control all of your weeds. You might need to do a second application of herbicide, or you may miss staging of something. The longer the weeds persist from the point of emergence until they're dead, the greater the yield loss because of nutrient uptake, because of use of moisture, and the larger the weed is at the time of crop emergence, the greater that amount of yield loss is. And then as we get later into May, the chance that the air and the soil temperatures will increase quickly becomes higher. And as we get warmer soils and warmer air temperatures, we see that crop emerging more quickly, and that shortens your post-seed pre-emerge weed control window, and you may miss it completely because you still have a couple thousand acres to put in before you get to spraying. So unless you have someone dedicated on the sprayer and someone dedicated to seeding, these types of situations can be fairly dangerous. So Lionel, I'm hoping that this doesn't steal your thunder, but I stole all your weeds and put them up for guys to take a look at, or gals to take a look at, as some of the issues that are out there currently. Early emerging weeds, the ones that really do have a major impact and the best chance to take advantage of early season growth, are those perennials. So here we're looking at Canada thistle on the left, quackgrass, and then dandelions. I've seen most of those out there already too. And tillage isn't generally useful with these types of weeds because of rhizomes with Canada thistle and quackgrass, and it never usually dislodges that taproot of that dandelion that's overwintered as a rosette. So challenging to use tillage to get these early emerging weeds, and with the dry and now wet, tillage can cause some problems as well. So those weeds, I would recommend that there's a pre-seed burn done when there's, even one or two of them in a meter squared. Some of the other ones that I've seen include the shepherd's purses and stinkweeds. Down on the right is shepherd's purse. Overwintered cleavers on the top picture, and then Canada fleabane, especially in the Carmen area, we see Canada fleabane that's overwintered. You can see that it was a rosette in the fall, and we're just starting to see some new green growth happen with those. Again, all weeds that are going to take advantage of that lack of crop competition. This is the danger of scouting by pictures instead of by actually knowing the weeds in the field. So for me, yes, this is a member of the pink family, or one of the, cow cockle, white cockle, night flowering catchfly, bladder campion type weeds, but I don't always know which one just from a picture. So white cockle is something that I saw more of when I was in Alberta. And it can be distinguished from something like cow cockle, bouncing bed, or bladder campion because of hairier leaves and a hairy stem. Distinguished from night flowering catchfly by lack of stickiness, which based on the picture I couldn't tell. And usually white cockle is the first one to emerge because it acts like a biennial or a short-lived perennial, but I've certainly seen night flowering catchfly emerge early on. And then if I really want to do good identification, I need to wait for the flowers, and no one wants to wait for flowers. We want to spray it instead. So if you're looking at some of these types of weeds, a good dose of glyphosate and then either a group 2 or a group 4 will help in effectively controlling most of the members of the pink family. But proper identification also helps, and I didn't do a good job based on the pictures that were there. Now, there are also annual weeds that are coming out, and if anyone's seen my tweet on Twitter, when I was growing out some of these kochia seedlings, I also managed to hatch some grasshopper nymphs that John Gavlowski is happily raising to be able to identify which grasshopper that field might be facing issues with in the future. So kochia up in the left, we've seen lots of it already emerging. Lamb's quarters with that kochia up on the top right, and then Lionel found not only emerged volunteer canola, but a striped flea beetle already. And striped flea beetles tend to emerge later in the season. So you know it's been warm if we already are seeing striped flea beetles out there. And all of these weeds, a little bit easier to control with tillage, but definitely they're getting the advantage on any crop. Now, for those of you who can't tell what this is a more stressed kochia plant that's just starting to emerge. You can see that those cotyledons are a little more red, and certainly the leaf hairs or trichomes on this particular kochia plant are pretty exaggerated because it is a stressed kochia. So emerged when it was a little bit cooler and also under some drier conditions, and that would be a challenging weed at that stage to control. So you would need to wait for it to get a little bit bigger before you spray it, but at the same time, don't want to let it get it too big, especially if you're putting in something, if it's a glyphosate resistant kochia and you're relying on something like a bromoxynil as a tank mix. Bromoxynil, this is one of my pet peeves, is knowing when the staging of a particular herbicide is most effective. Bromoxynil up to the 4-leaf stage or 2 inches tall, so not a wide window of application for using bromoxynil for kochia control. Now, I mentioned the critical weed-free period, and so I threw up this slide just so that you have an idea of when you're trying to keep that crop basically weed-free, when it's best to manage those weeds. So for spring wheat, 1 to 3 leaf stage is the critical period. After that, you're really looking at sort of revenge spraying at times, unless there's a significant weed flush. Canola from the 2 to 4 to 6 leaf stage. So once it's cabbaged in, we really don't need to be worrying about weed control in canola. Soybeans from emergence, so a little bit earlier that soybean is seeing yield losses from weed competition up to the 3rd trifoliate leaf. Corn 3 to 10 leaf stage, and I prefer collars, but this was from the University of Guelph and they were still using leaves. And then I threw in some horticulture crops just to show you the advantage of most of our annual crops. With carrots, you're looking from emergence to 6 to 12 weeks that it needs to be weed free. Strawberries, when they're newly established, all of May and June needs to be weed free. And onions, well, if there's ever a weed, then there's always yield loss. So our cropping systems with the annual crops that we grow, certainly we have a shorter critical weed-free period, thankfully, to keep weeds out of the crop. Now, some pre-seed spraying guidelines, and this I stole from, it's an older picture that I've stolen from Dow AgroSciences, so Corteva now, but certainly showing you some guidelines as far as what the overnight temperatures are and what your pre-seed application recommendations should be. So at 0 degrees, you need to wait until those weeds are actively growing, and typically a weed doesn't start actively growing until you have at least 5 degrees and it's rising, hopefully some sunshine to help out as well. When that overnight temperature has gone down to -2 and even down to -5 degrees, you're going to want to wait a little bit longer and make sure that that weed is actively growing. So we need it to get up to probably 8 degrees and rising for at least 2 to 4 hours so that you know, especially things like dandelions and Canada thistle, that they've gone back into actively growing. And if it's been -5 degrees or colder, wait a couple of days. I would say 3 days, but they're saying wait 1 or 2 days of overnight lows that are 0 degrees or warmer at a very minimum. So this is from 2015 if you look at the hashtag, but these rules of thumb really haven't changed. And if we look at spraying after a frost, this one is one that I stole from Syngenta. So if it's a light frost where you just had it dip below 0 and you're trying to kill any type of a weed, really wait until the warmest part of the day to spray. And we're trying to get daytime temperatures of at least 10 degrees with your in-crop type of spray application, so in-season spraying. If there's been a hard frost, down to -3 for any extended period of time, an hour or 6 hours, you want to wait until the warm part of the same day to spray. But for perennials, they take a little bit longer to get back into growth mode, so wait until the next day. And your spraying to seeding interval, if you're spraying annuals, you can usually wait a few hours and you get uptake of that herbicide into the annual and get decently consistent results. I prefer a 24-hour window between when you spray and when you seed, so that you make sure, and a lot of the labels say that as well. So I don't like to push it this 8 to 12 hours like Syngenta has. I would say 24 hours. But if you have a perennial and you need to get glyphosate or any other active ingredient translocating through that weed, you really do need to wait 3 days between when you do the spray application and the seeding operation to get consistent results. Okay, herbicide carryover considerations for 2019 sort of alluded to the fact that sometimes we do have some residual herbicides that cause recropping restrictions. Typically, we're looking at 150 millimeters of in-season rainfall as normal for the risk for herbicide carryover. 175 millimeters, sometimes it really does depend on the herbicide. What will happen if you do have herbicide carryover is that you can see delayed maturity or patchy emergence or even crop failure depending on the amount of herbicide carryover that happens. So in Manitoba in 2018, the areas with the lowest precipitation included in the central region, the Treeherne, Elm Creek, and Eli area, and I've got a map in a minute to show you that will give you some of those highlighted areas. There's a stretch from Eden, McCreary, St. Rose, and Warkton in northwestern Manitoba that probably has some concern. And then in south central Manitoba, the lowest rainfall areas were in Altona and Gretna. Back in 2018, the herbicide carryover that we saw impacted on a surprising number of crops. So I saw wheat injury, canola, corn, and peas. And there's the potential for pockets of that to happen again this year. In 2018, it was most obvious in areas of overlap, so maybe where you prime the sprayer or where the headlands, and also where the applicators were slowing down or turning, so slowing down around a hydro pole or around a slough, or coming up to a bumpy area, whether that's a drainage ditch or some path going through the field. We could certainly see that those higher application areas had resulted in increased herbicide carryover. Also low organic matter areas, and then higher low pH soils. And there is a recropping restriction guide listed in the Field Guide to Crop Protection that does help you out with assessing risks. The caveat there is that if there's a blank box, it doesn't mean go ahead and plant that crop. It means we don't have a recommendation on what to do with that, and you need to consult either your agronomist or the local chem rep to give you some guidance on what's going on with that particular herbicide and that particular crop. So here's what the map looks like if we look at the June to September precipitation and how that impacts on herbicide carryover. Anything with less than 150 millimeters of rain, and the lowest that we saw was 107 mils, is in a light yellow. So those are the ones where you would want to look at your local data, your in-field data as far as rainfall amounts, and then what types of herbicides you were using that may have some residual activity to assess your soil carryover. You will notice that there are no red hotspots on this map. If you look at the Saskatchewan map, they have a lot of red areas where they had less than 75 millimeters of precipitation. So we're not in the same extreme danger that they are, which is why we haven't put out a lot of alerts about the herbicide carryover, but it is still something that if you're doing some last minute cropping changes, you should be looking at what residual herbicides you maybe used last year and also what time of the year you used them. If it was a pre-seed application, probably less risk than if it was something that was in crop and a later application. So if we look at recropping restrictions, I'll apologize. This is from the 2018 guide. I didn't update the image, and I should have, just ran out of time. But you'll notice that, so something like command, I love, because this has a number in every box, and you know how long you should wait, how many years or how many months you should wait before you use a particular crop after that herbicide application. On the flip side, something like Prime Extra 2 Magnum, lots of empty boxes and a bunch of stars saying that you have limited cropping options, and you need to take a closer look at that. So if we look at the Prime Extra 2 Magnum, which is atrazine and metolachlor, which earlier, there is a warning that says do not plant any crop other than corn in the same year. And then in the prairie provinces, corn must be planted the year following application. And when you've had stress conditions, then you may see injury if any other rotational crop is used. So certainly be aware when you're using a residual product that you have some issues. And so the sensitivity of rotational crops, we know potatoes are extremely sensitive. Pulse crops, so lentils, peas, faba beans, dry beans, and soybeans all have sensitivity. The picture that's here is actually industrial hemp with atrazine carryover, not on the list, but definitely sensitive as well. Sunflowers are more sensitive than corn, which is, you know, more sensitive than canola, which is more sensitive than your cereals. So as you get stuck into it and you need to look for a less sensitive crop, then cereals are usually your best bet. That being said, we saw some striping on the left in wheat with some residual herbicides and some impact of trifluralin on corn as well. Other factors in consideration there, the amount of soil moisture was also an impact on that corn, and there had been a cover crop of rye that hadn't been terminated very quickly, so very dry, maybe some allelopathy, and then also herbicide carryover impacting on that corn. So a triple resistance, because I am chewing up the time here. Herbicide resistance is an inherited ability to survive a normally lethal dose of a herbicide. So if in the past that particular herbicide has killed that weed and suddenly it's not killing that weed, and then it's also not killing the progeny of that particular weed, then we have confirmed herbicide resistance. And globally, 499 unique cases the last time I checked on weedscience.org, but that seems to be increasing fairly steadily. So if it hasn't changed yet, it's likely to change soon. Their unique cases means that it's a particular species and then the number of sites of action that it's resistant to. So if it's only group 1 resistant wild oats, that's one species by site interaction. If it's then we find another population that's both group 1 and group 2 resistant wild oats, then that's another unique case. And that's how you get up to 499 unique cases within 255 species. There is resistance to 23 of the 26 known herbicide sites of action, and that impacts on 166 different herbicides. Now in Canada, the last time that Hugh Becky updated his slide, which was at a presentation that I saw in 2018, there were 76 unique herbicide-resistant weed cases for across Canada. Within Manitoba, we saw 30 of those biotypes, and that includes wild oat, green foxtail, and yellow foxtail, barnyard grass, wild mustard, kochia, stinkweed, shepherd's purse, hemp nettle, cleavers, chickweed, and red root pigweed, just to name a few. And that continues to increase as well. It was 88 when we saw green foxtail with group 3 resistance and kochia with group 2 resistance, and we've just increased from there. How herbicide resistance spreads. Certainly there are a lot of factors. So within the field, you start out with a couple of resistant individuals that survive a herbicide application, and after a few years, elect for more of the survivors are then resistant, and eventually you have a large patch that increases and covers the field. Now with a tumbleweed such as kochia, you'll see the picture on the right where I've dropped a whole bunch of pins, and that was me following along and sampling glyphosate-resistant kochia in a soybean field. It was just the one tumbleweed that had tumbled through the year before, so I had a nice straight line to follow. But there are other options as well. Certainly wildlife, whether it's ducks or deer, and also water. I was very worried with some of the flooding predictions that we were going to see an increase in herbicide-resistant weeds floating up from the States. Thankfully, with limited flooding, that will be less of a danger, but still something that we need to think about. And then within the field and also from field to field, equipment can be a huge issue as far as spreading resistance. The one that comes to mind for me is the introduction of some water hemp into Manitoba through a combine that was purchased in the US. And that red root pigweed seed is very, very small, shiny black. And the one that we're more familiar with, the water hemp seed, is virtually indistinguishable from red root pigweed. So you can imagine how hard it is to clean out that very small seed out of something as large as a combine or a drill, whatever the case may be. Now within Manitoba, I've bragged about this before, but we are a leader in wild oat resistance. Back in 2002, of the fields that had wild oat, about 44% of them had some level of herbicide resistance. Not that every wild oat in that field is resistant, but that there is some level of herbicide resistance in those fields. By 2008, that was up to 60% of the fields that have wild oat have some level of herbicide resistance, and most of that's group 1, but some of it is group 2, and some of those populations certainly are both group 1 and group 2. And when they did the resistance survey in 2016, they have 151 fields surveyed. 102 of those had wild oat. Of the 102 that have wild oats, there is about 79% that have some level of herbicide resistance. 78% is group 1, but you can see that the proportion of group 2 resistance has increased as well, and that the number of fields that have both group 1 and 2 resistance has exploded to 42%. So that's something that we need to keep in mind when we're seeing escapes after we've done a herbicide application. How many of those plants that escape are actually resistant? We do need to be doing that after herbicide field walk and make sure that we assess how much resistance we may have in a field. Okay, glyphosate resistance. I've talked about this a ton, so I'm going to be very brief here, but glyphosate-resistant kochia in Manitoba has been spreading, and this is underreported. No doubt about it, underreported. There are many guys, gals, however you want to put it, that don't sample simply because they've seen glyphosate fail and they feel that they have some level of resistance in that field, and they've just started automatically managing that resistance with other modes of action and other strategies. But from a knowledge perspective, doing the test to know what level of resistance you have or what proportion of the individuals within a field are resistant will help you with your management strategy. So back in 2016, we had 5 municipalities where there was confirmed glyphosate resistance. By 2018, it was 12. And as I've said in other presentations, I know that Wallace Woodworth has glyphosate-resistant kochia. I know Grassland has. I know that Victoria does, Portage as well. So there are other municipalities that have it, that either use different labs for testing herbicide resistance or just didn't report it for one reason or another. So the distribution is out there and we just need to be aware of it. If we look at what happened in Alberta in 2017, they did 305 sites. They found 100% of those sites had resistance to group 2 herbicides, 50% had some level of resistance to glyphosate within the population, and 8% were dicamba resistant. 10% of the samples had resistance to all 3 herbicide groups. So if it was dicamba resistant, it was typically resistant to glyphosate and to group 2s as well. In 2018, we collected 300 sites in Manitoba for the same type of testing that hasn't been completed yet, but I am anxious to see what those results look like. And if we review herbicide resistance from a Canadian perspective, in 2012, glyphosate resistance was confirmed in Alberta and Saskatchewan. By 2014, it was confirmed in Manitoba. In 2015, they had a really unique situation in Saskatchewan where they found dicamba resistance, fluroxypyr resistance, as well as the group 2s and the group, as well as the group 2s, so thiophene and tribenuron. And then in 2017, we've got the full meal deal with dicamba resistance, glyphosate resistance, and the group 2s as well. So 3 sites of action with resistance. So if we quickly look at kochia control options in wheat, this is where it gets a little bit scary because I recommend that we use multiple modes of effective action. We can see that there are lots of options that are effective in wheat, but a lot of them are a single mode of action. If we remove that out, we shorten the list up quite considerably. And then if we factor in group 2 resistance is very predominant out there, then we shorten the list even further. And if you look at that group 6, typically the group 6 that's in there is that bromoxynil component, and that group 6 bromoxynil component is only effective up until 2 inches. So again, we do have some great options in wheat for control, but we do need to be aware of when they're applied. So something like Fierce, which is a pre-seed, that group 14 and 15, and then also the staging of the weed to make sure that we get effective control. The other one that we had a lot of comments about in 2018 were the pigweeds. I think because we were most concerned about Palmer amaranth or water hemp, but we saw that there was some other types of pigweeds in our cropping systems. And so in addition to the red root pigweed, which on the right picture is the right seed head, we have the left seed head, which is Powell amaranth. And we did see it coming through fairly strongly in a few fields. Now, was it herbicide resistance or environmental influence? Staging is key. Pigweed is not easy to control in a dry year like 2018 was. And with those hot conditions, something like pigweed, which is a C4, really enjoys sunshine, can't tolerate shading, but when it's hot and dry, it takes advantage of those conditions and really grows quickly, gets out of stage really, really fast. But the other part of it is that we did confirm that there was an increasing level of group 2 resistance in that pigweed population, in the red root pigweed population. We did not see it in the Powell amaranth there. So in 2002, we had 1 field out of 28 that was group 2 resistant of the random sampling that we did. In 2016, we had 1 out of 22 fields, so 5%. And again, that's stratified but random sampling. In 2018, in a very focused sample group of 5 fields, we found some level of resistance in 4 of those 5 fields. So low end, it was 40% resistance. At the high end, we had 1 field that came back with 90% of those pigweeds being resistant. So varying levels of resistance. And when you look at those seedlings, they're very challenging to tell apart. That's a whole other lecture that I can put on, so I'm just going to leave it there. Herbicide resistance is a factor. Improving the odds, we need to apply our effective herbicides effectively, the right rates. So for instance, there are 2 rates of fluroxypyr for cleaver control and kochia control. The low rate, the 28 grams, is usually for cleavers, and 40 grams is for, and that's spring emerging small cleavers, and the kochia rate at 40 grams per acre is much higher, but if you use the 28 gram rate, you do not expect kochia control. So you need to know what mix you're using for which crop and which weeds. The right stage, also the right weather. If it's hot and dry, you're going to have a harder time killing those weeds. Also, if it's cool and they're not actively growing, as we demonstrated with the, light frost and that sort of thing. You need to pay attention to water volume, your droplet size, and your coverage. You definitely need to be looking at different modes of action. Herbicide layering, we're going to touch on in a second here. Zero tolerance seems like a ridiculous goal, but quite honestly, if you have herbicide resistant weeds in a field, you should be looking at zero tolerance. Mowing, silaging, tillage, hand weeding, whatever it takes to make sure that you are not increasing the seed bank with a herbicide resistant weed. And there are other management methods that you need to take a look at. Crop rotation, your crop type, different varieties are more competitive, using certified seed, varying your seeding date, narrowing your row widths to try and increase crop competition and increase shading, which is especially effective with those C4 weeds, and then fertilizing in row rather than a weed and feed system where you broadcast that fertilizer and then feed those weeds. Now, we're not going to manage herbicide resistance with herbicides alone, but herbicides still are a really key tool. And so herbicide layering is the one thing that we're looking at. And that's where you're going to use a pre-seed or a pre-plant incorporated to keep those weeds small early on, and then go back with an in-crop that's also effective on those weeds to help with controlling flushes of weeds or hard to control weeds with more than one spray pass. That can help with improved weed control and extending that critical weed-free, or shortening that amount of time where you have a critical weed-free period. And then it can also be used when you have herbicide resistance, right? And so this is what we're looking at as my ideal, which is a traditional soybean program from Bob Hartzler in Iowa, where he's maybe using some pre-seed tillage, a residual herbicide, and then he's looking at a post-emerge herbicide as well that's effective on that same weed. So this is my ideal as far as how we can do the best when we're relying on herbicides, but integrating some other cultural controls like tillage or altering our seeding date so that we can get that crop through that critical weed-free period and get that canopy closure as quick as possible and have a relatively low amount of weeds in that crop. So this is my final slide, and we're looking at something. I'll back up. Started out on Twitter, and it says 100,000 Palmer amaranth seeds per plant. That sounds pretty scary, except that's a common ragweed seed head and common ragweed leaves for sure. Palmer amaranth has a much longer seed head, and it's a pigweed, so the seed is not going to be finely divided or divided at all. It's an entire leaf with a long petiole. So Palmer amaranth, much different looking plant. The seeds on an amaranth, because it's a pigweed species, are tiny, shiny, and black instead. And from all the literature that I've seen, we're looking at between 600,000 and 1 million seeds per plant that are produced by a Palmer amaranth plant. So the reason that I bring that up is because I want you to question everything I've said. I want you to question everything that you hear and make sure that it makes sense. Make sure that it is actually a fact. Because when we're rushing through things, we sometimes misspeak or we haven't done all the research that we need to. And knowing the facts is critical when we're looking at herbicide resistance, when we're looking at herbicide carryover, and we're looking at making sure that we optimize our herbicide applications. So there, I took almost a full hour on you, Lionel. I'm very sorry.
Not a problem, Tammy. It was all real good information. And if you've got a second, I've got one question here that somebody sent me on my phone here.
Sure.
Regarding Fortress and looking at using this Fortress this year in his wheat to control kochia, low moisture situation. What does he need to do after the application before seeding? Does he need to harrow it, or is one seeding pass good enough, or what would be your recommendation there?
Okay, So if I'm not sure if you can hear me in the background flipping through my 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 guide to crop protection, because I knew you were going to ask me this question, and yet I totally didn't look this up. I did look at the edge and the incorporation there, but I don't know the Fortress herbicide label all that well. It would be better if I respond to you offline and you get back to that person that way. But following the label, Fortress, as I recall, it really isn't a moisture activation. It is more of a soil incorporation and making sure that you have that consistent layer. So that would be my key, but I'll get you some more notes offline.
That would be great, and then I can send it to them.
Yep.
The other thing, just a comment on your presentation about the spraying post-seeding pre-emerge. I agree with you 100% that time interval is really narrow, and I always get the question every year. My wheat is in the one leaf or still hasn't uncurled yet and just coming through the ground. Can I still spray it with Roundup? So,
no. Well, if you want to kill it, yes.
People get caught every year, so I think definitely that's a tricky one. So great, thanks, Tammy.
Thank you.
Lori, if you could turn the screen over to me, we will go through a few slides here and finish up for today. Okay, so just a little bit of an update. Over the past week, we did get some rain and snow pretty much through the whole southwest and even through to the central part of the region. And I think most areas are reporting anywhere between 5 and 10. I think maybe a little bit more as you get closer to the border. Seeding is started and going in the area, and I think right now we'd probably be about 5% done, with the majority of the crop being planted is peas and wheat. Actually surprised the amount of wheat that's going in, even in some cases before the peas. And there is definitely lots of field work that is being done to prep the soil for getting the crop in. Like always, I like to share this with everybody every week, and it kind of just gives us an update as to where we are compared to over the past 7 days worth of precipitation. And you can see that throughout the southwest here, it was Macaulay that kind of got the majority of precipitation. But when you look on the far right-hand side, you can see where we're sitting as an average, and you can see that we are definitely lower than than our average over the for the last for this time of year. Soil temperatures. I've been getting a lot of calls on this, or a lot of questions about this, and it seems like you. First thing you do when somebody gives you a call or wants to talk to you, they want to know what the soil temperature is. So I just grabbed a few off of our weather stations, and in most cases we're between 2 and 6, especially over the last 5 to 6 or 7 days here. The temperature has been fairly constant in that 2 to 6 range. So good for getting those peas and wheat crops in the ground, but still maybe a little bit earlier for some of the other crops like canola, and definitely something like pushing the envelope on soybeans or some of those crop, or corn even right now. And I did hear a few people looking at starting to put some corn in the ground. Put this one up last week, and I felt I'd put it up again just so you know that this is the best minimum germination temperatures for different crops, and you can see that 2 to 6 range brings in most of the cereals and peas. Calling for some rain, and I think most people have heard this, and I think throughout the southwest here, I think in most cases it would be something that would be wouldn't keep us off the land for very long, because we are in a little bit of a dry situation. Look at the DTM maps for temperature and precipitation. Looks like most of it is going to be to the south, so I think southern part of the province might be in for a little bit of rain. Looks like it might go as far north as the park in some areas, but I think in general we're looking at maybe just a small amount of rain. This is again, percent of normal, and this came from Ag Canada, and I just thought to show what areas right now that are really showing that, and I'm getting a lot of farmers asking or talking about dry conditions and maybe even changing some of their seeding practices or not even that, just changing some of their crops or thinking about changing some of their crops if we don't get some moisture out of some of these events that are going to go through. And you can see there are definitely areas in the yellow here where we're like, 40 to 60% of normal moisture. And then this is the updated percentage of average precipitation. And again, you look and it seems like it's that area where we've been, where it's the driest seems to be staying the driest area, getting less rainfall. A little bit about what's happening with some of the crop that didn't even get harvested last fall. There's a fair bit of it throughout the Southwest here, and harvest does continue. We're seeing crops that stayed out, basically wheat, oats, canola, and soybeans. I think a lot of them are being harvested right now. I don't think anybody is having great problems harvesting them, besides the fact that the fields are staying fairly wet, and you can see a canopy like this that is lying down and covering the ground. You can see where it'd definitely be holding in a lot of moisture. So I think that's one of that issue, and then trying to get a clean sample, I think, is the other issue. Regarding quality-wise, I would imagine, I haven't talked to any of the elevators, but I'm thinking that a lot of the wheat is definitely bleached a lot. I heard that a lot of the cereal crops still have a lot of weight to them, so I think weight-wise we're not too bad. It's just trying to get a clean sample and probably just trying to find another way of marketing them, and looking at probably a lot of feed options, I would imagine. Tammy showed this slide, and I figured I'd show it too, just a heads up for anybody that is looking at planting canola. I showed the soil temperatures, and we're needing anywhere from 7 to 10 degrees Celsius for the canola to germinate. And if these guys are out and moving around already, and actually there's two of them in this picture. There's another guy right there on the stubble. You definitely don't want to have 20% of your canola coming up at a time in intervals, because they'll definitely be doing a lot of damage. So if at all possible, I would be holding off on planting canola yet. And just a reminder that your seed treatment, basically the days start counting off the day that seed goes in the ground. And so just to be aware of not getting too eager to put the seed in the ground until it warms up. And it's going to warm up shortly here, so a couple of days isn't going to make a big difference, and it should be nice to have all that canola coming up at the same time. I put this on more for just people's own information, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through it, but basically what you're looking at is the increase, the seeding acreage reports, and our expected seeded acreage reports for this coming year, and you can definitely see where wheat and barley are going up, and canola going down, and soybeans going down, which are kind of the major crops throughout the Southwest here anyway. So a little bit of change in the country out there this year with the crops that are being planted. Regarding the field crop production guide that Tammy had referred to a couple times through her presentation, and I would say that most offices have them still. So if you want one, get to the office or make a phone call to your local rep, and they'll save you a copy. They're $10 this year. Laurie, is there any questions?
Go ahead, Tammy.
I just wanted to talk a minute about Fortress, because I did get the answer while you were speaking, Lionel. So Fortress, being a combination of trifluralin and trilate, really does require incorporation. It's not so much about the soil moisture. It requires 2 incorporations. The first one within 24 hours of application if you're doing a spring application, and then there needs to be a delay, a couple of days before you do the second incorporation. And if it's cold or dry, then the recommendation is that you increase your seeding rate for wheat or barley by about 10%, just to make sure that you are going to have a good crop stand establishment. There is some challenges under those types of conditions for the wheat or barley. So you can see a little bit of impact on the crop. It is a little bit sensitive. You need to make sure that you're seeding below that herbicide layer, and that will certainly help out as well. But bumping up your seeding rate a little bit is a nice recommendation too.
Okay. I know the question I'm going to get, Tammy, is one incorporation would be harrowing with a heavy harrow, and next incorporation would be by seeding.
I think the recommendation is that both incorporations are harrow incorporations. The seeding doesn't necessarily always do a good job of consistently incorporating and making sure that you have a really nice level amount of incorporation. So it's challenging to use seeding depending on what kind of sweeps or what kind of drill or seeder you're using to rely on that incorporation as an effective second incorporation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tammy, and thanks for getting that information. Okay, so the seasonal reports have started. This first week's crop report will be is out already. Checking the Manitoba Ag website for all these updates, as well as the insect and disease and the weather. If you're wanting to get onto our weather stations, that's a good place to go and get all the information of current weather and past weather conditions. Crop Chatter is up and going, and there's a couple of good topics on there right now about crops affected by flooding and fertilizing hybrid fall rye. There's another good topic there. So if you're looking at getting or needing information on any of those ones, definitely go to the Crop Chatter site. Definitely follow us on Twitter for updates as we go through the growing season. Got questions and need to talk to somebody regarding something that's going on, here's a list of the crop production extension people in Manitoba here, so feel free to contact any one of them. If they can't help you, I'm sure they can find or have access to people like Tammy and John Hurd, John Gavlosky, Dave Kaminsky, and we can definitely find or help you find out the answer to what's happening in your field. And your credits, if you want to get a hold of Lori, that's her email address to get your CCA credits. And join us next week, May the 8th. If there's no other questions, Lori, we'll sign off for today.
There are no other questions, so everyone have a great day.